circles for our hoops quilt. It's a really fun baby size or wall hanging quilt, and it may look intimidating at first. If you've never inset a circle, you might be looking at it thinking, oh wow, thin circle, that looks challenging. It's pieced, not appliqued. I'm going to walk you through it because it is actually fairly straightforward. And this quilt only has 6 seams. The pattern is in our publication, A Quilter's Guide to Solids. And in that publication, there is a link to download the templates that you'll need to cut out the rings for the hoops quilt. That will print out on 6 pages. And one thing that's noted that's very important is when you print, you always want to make sure that you don't enlarge or reduce the printout. Most printers have a little tick box that says scale to fit or fit to page. You don't want that. You want to make sure it's printing at 100% actual size. And if you're not sure, the way to check is when you get your printout, there's a 1-inch test square that you can measure, and you'll see if it measures exactly 1 inch, you're set. Everything's good. If it's off for some reason, check your settings and try again. When you print out those 6 pages, they're very easy to tape together into one large template sheet. And this will get cut into 3 separate hoops. So this is a little bit like a cooking show. I've prepared ahead of time one of those hoops. I've already cut it out. One little bit of advice is we keep an old rotary cutter and blade that's dulled a bit that we use to cut paper, because that way it doesn't, paper dulls blades. If I'm cutting the template and paper at the same time, I might use a new blade, but just for paper, it's ideal to use an older blade. The next trick is we have our handy dandy tape dispenser that has 2 kinds of tape, regular tape and double face tape. And I put little tabs of double face tape on the back of my template. You could also just do loops of regular tape, but they will help keep the template in place when you're cutting, because it's large, you don't want it to shift. So what I'm doing here is, I've actually done this a little bit ahead of time. I'm laying my template down, as you can see, and there are some little dashed lines. There are all the way across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. And those are going to be important registration marks that we'll use when we inset this into the background fabric. I have marked those registration marks with chalk ahead of time, and I'm marking those dashed ones. And I'm going to transfer those to the hoop that I cut out in a minute. But then I'm going to cut on the inside and the outside. Right now I'm working on the large hoop. And if you notice, I'm doing this freehand. Just kind of hold it down as you go. One of the great things about these hoops is they're so large that they have a fair amount of stretch in them. So if you accidentally go over the template just a little bit and cut a sliver of paper off, like I just did, it won't really affect it. Like that little amount, not a big deal. I'm going to go around and do the same thing on the outside. And I just kind of walk along with my fingers here to make sure the template doesn't shift. But that's where that double face tape or a loop of tape is especially helpful. And it's a big hoop, so you really have to kind of walk around it a bit as you do this. But when you get all the way around, you gently lift off this template. Be careful, you'll need it one more time. But what I'm going to do now is transfer those registration marks. And you can do this either by hand, freehand, or I can grab my ruler whatever works for you. But it's very, very important. I'm going to just do these freehand. It's very important to have those marks. So now I have, oops, there's sometimes a little sliver left over. I've got my hoop. And every now and then, when you're doing a circle like that, you miss a little bit. This is my hoop. I'm going to treat it gently. You don't want to yank on it and distort it. But I'm going to just set that aside for a moment. And I'll no longer need this, so I'll set this aside as well. Just like the cooking show, I've prepared this ahead of time for you. I have got my top, and I've already inset the medium-sized circle in this. And I'll actually show, you can see from the back that I've inset it and I've pressed the seams open. We like to press our seams open because it makes everything lie flat. You don't have to, it's up to you. But it lies flat, and because these hoops are so large, you don't even have to notch the seams. They have a natural ease to them. So now the next step is to cut the hole that this hoop will go in this background fabric. So I have prepped this following the pattern. The pattern has measurements that you draw lines in from the edge, and those are what you use to set, put this right here, your hoop, basically aligning it, and I'm just pushing down to get it. There we go. So it's touching tangent to these two lines. Now this time, this is one of the most important steps in this quilt. Do not cut on the outside of this template. You'll end up with a hole that's the exact same size as your hoop, and that won't work. What we need now is a smaller hole. So you have dashed lines, 2 concentric circles in the middle of this template. So this time you're going to cut through the template and the fabric at the same time. And I'm using my fabric blade for this because it's sharp enough to go through both layers. So I'm cutting in this. I'm going definitely carefully and slowly, kind of walking my fingers along to stabilize the template. And I change directions fairly frequently because I find it a little awkward and dangerous to cut towards myself. So I've gone all the way around on the first dash line, and now I'm going to do the second one. And this is creating a very thin, 1/2 inch thick hoop that we're actually going to remove. It gets discarded, but it creates a space for us to inset and piece that other hoop, the kind of flamingo pink one. Okay, now, once again, I'm going to need my chalk and I'm going to make registration marks. But I'm going to carefully remove the outer ring. I don't need that. I'm going to carefully remove the inner one. And I'll see my little dash registration marks, which I'm going to transfer both inside and outside. And this is shown in the pattern, but it's good to just remind you here. And now, this is a bit of the magic. I'm going to remove both the thin strip. Oops, once again, there's a little sliver I missed. The thin strip and the paper strip. And this is very common when you're cutting through paper, that there are tiny bits that don't cut. But look at that, they come right out with just a little work. So I won't need this. And I have the inside of the hoop, the background, and the hoop itself. And this is where the magic happens. I really enjoy this. What I'm going to do is line this up on top. So you can see this is going in here. And it's a two-step process. First, I'm going to inset this gray inner part of the hoop into the ring itself. I'll sew that, I'll press it open, and then I'll take that unit and put the whole unit in the remaining hole. So the way you do that, I'll just demonstrate putting the center in the ring. You need to pin right sides together. And this is a little awkward. If you're used to working with blocks that are just squares that you flip together, this kind of goes inside out on you. So watch. I take my registration mark and I'm folding this in towards me, and I'm lining up the gray edge and the inner edge, and I'm pinning right at the registration mark. Then I go to the opposite pin. I find the registration marks, fold them together so the edges are flush, pin that. Then I go to the sides and I do the same thing. Pin, pin, sides. I pin there. And then I do, at these kind of quarter circle areas, I line those up and pin. And we find that alternating sides, the way I'm doing right now, just helps minimize the stretching, and it stabilizes things. It's a good habit. So now I'll go over here, only 2 pins left. And the final pin. And I'm actually going to remove this just so we can see it a little bit better. So now you have the base, the inside, with this circle carefully pinned. Some people like to have additional pins, in which case you can kind of just find the center and pin there. I don't do that. I kind of ease out the fabric with my fingers as I sew, which you'll see in a moment. But the very important thing to demonstrate now is, you see how this inner part lies nice and flat? This is how we're going to sew. So it's going to go through the sewing machine this way. You do not want to sew it like this, because then that hoop gets all bunched up and you'll sew in a bunch of tucks or pleats. So when you're doing circles like this, there's always one side that you can just tell naturally wants to lie more flat, and that's the one you want on your sewing table as you sew. I'm going to go over the machine. You can join me as I go around, and then I'll show you how that turns out after it's pressed. I've moved to the table, and as you can see, I've got my pinned piece flat on the table with that gray circle down and the hoop on top. I've prepared my machine with gray thread and a 1/4 inch foot. You can use whatever foot you're comfortable with. I find a 1/4 inch foot to be especially helpful when I'm going around a circle. Now, I'm going to go right under here and lower that. I'm very careful. I don't sew over pins. I don't want broken needles flying. But what I'm going to do is just start sewing and pause to take out my pin. Now, you'll see sometimes you'll have a little sliver like that you trim off just from the way you cut it with a template. But in general, the goal now is to sew the hoop to the circle with edges flush. So I kind of use my fingers to move that around and just kind of ease it. As I said, you could pin, but I find it a little easier just to use my fingers. And I go around. And because there's so much bias in these circles, it's amazing how easily the edges line up. You don't have to force anything here. Now, if you're new to this, one of my suggestions is to start with the biggest hoop first because it's the easiest. The smaller one is a little tighter and doesn't have as much stretch. Don't worry about wrinkles that are on the left of the needle. They're not going to get under the tuck. As long as it's smoothed out right where your needle is, you'll be fine. So here, take a look at this. It's an amazing hoop. Really nice. It's easy to smooth out. When I flip it over, you can see we've got a nice 1/4 inch seam that I'm going to go press, and then I'll meet you back at the table where I'll show you the last step for pinning. Now I've got my circle so nicely pieced, and I just need to inset it into the hole of the background fabric. The procedure is almost identical. We need right sides together at the registration marks. So I'm going to fold this in, making sure it's flush, and I'll pin. Now this is a little awkward thing. I have a registration mark here, and so I have to fold this whole thing on top and find those registration marks and pin. And then I have to find all 8 of these, line them up, and pin. And this looks like one big mess, But it really isn't. There's a method to this. We're doing exactly what we did before. It's just that this outer piece, this background fabric, is so much larger. So I would make my way around and do all 8 pins. And by the time I'm done with that, it's going to kind of look like this. Everything will be together. And then you just take that over and you sew around 1/4 inch from the edge in the exact same way you did and press it open. You'll end up with 3 nice inset hoops. Each of them, in our case, was a different color. You could make this a 2-color quilt. You could easily do 3 white hoops on a red background. One of the advantages of that is you can cut all 3 hoops from the same fat quarter if you want. The other thing to note is that we did this with a French pillowcase binding, which is rather than having an applied binding, the quilt is turned inside out, as it's a really different technique. It's fun and it gives you a great result. We actually did a tutorial on that in part 2 of our Hello Baby quilt tutorial on YouTube, so you can check that out as well. So have fun with not only making it and conquering these curves, because they are straightforward, but also the color work. Even though it's only 4 pieces, it's really fun. You know, it's especially, I think, great with solids, because look how those colors pop.